Hello and welcome to this Speeki webinar. My name is Scott Lang and I'm going to be your leader for today's webinar. If you've joined a Speeki webinar before, then welcome back. We appreciate you joining us. If you are new to the Speeki webinar series, the series is a 30-minute webinar. So it is a very quick overview of a particular topic. We do tend to dig fairly deep within that 30-minute period, and so it is a fairly detailed review of a particular topic. So welcome for those that are joining us. Today's focus is on the topic of biodiversity. Now, most of you are probably familiar with the various sustainability standards and reviews and ISO initiatives and some of the protocols which have been launched over the last few years. And frankly, there's been a lot of them, and there's been a little bit overwhelming. So to add to that level of complexity, we have yet another new standard. This one is on biodiversity, which is one area that I think has been underutilized and under-resourced to date. So this standard which has been released is an ISO standard, and I'm going to talk through what that standard is. I'm going to walk you through the entire element of the standard and try and give you as much as I can as an overview within a 30-minute period. So welcome to understanding what biodiversity is, and in particularly a focus on the new ISO standard, which has not long been released. So let's do a little bit of introduction to what we're going to be focused on in this session. So firstly, many of you will be familiar with ISO standards, and if you're not, then I definitely encourage you to get your head around what these ISO standards do. 10 or 15 years ago, when I started getting involved in these standards, it was relatively new to me, and when I would read these standards, frankly, I would find them quite challenging. I'm pleased to say that 10 to 15 years on, I now understand what ISO means and how it works and what the words mean, and I've been able to get my head around ISO speak, as we call it. So for sometimes, if you're new to this area, it can be a little bit overwhelming, but my encouragement is to persevere and to keep reading, keep learning about ISO standards, because they are actually very well done. They are very well linked together, and they're very consistent in the way they're applied. So once you learn one, you tend to learn them all. So this one is about biodiversity. And what this biodiversity standard does is it sets up a framework for managing biodiversity in your organization. Now, at its core, what the standard is trying to do is to give you a framework and an approach. And it says, if you want to manage biodiversity within your organization, biodiversity risks, then you'll need some sort of a framework. And so this is the framework that ISO has suggested. Now, like all ISO frameworks, it is quite flexible. So you can go with a small company, a large company, for-profit, a non-profit, private, public company. It's a framework. And part of the role of the ISO standard is to fit your framework to your company. So you right-size the framework depending on the sort of organization you are, how you operate, what you do, the sorts of biodiversity areas of focus. The standard is entirely flexible. So whether you're 3 people or you're 30 million people, it is very much a standard which can be applied to any organization. So with that in mind, let's start looking at what the standard means, and we'll try and get into some of the clear questions. Now, I mentioned at the start that it was a standard that can be applied to any organization. So the focus is at the start of this initiative is to stand back and say, what sort of organization are we? Because that is going to define how we build our biodiversity initiatives. And that's going to very, very much depend on what the scope of your biodiversity initiatives are, the sort of organization you are, the boundaries that you define for your biodiversity initiatives. It's going to look at some of the initial things you already have in place around biodiversity. And it's also going to consider the sorts of stakeholders that you have that impact your biodiversity programs. Now, in the standard, we often call them interested parties. However, we tend to call them, in the ISO world, we call them stakeholders. So as we go through the standard, I will walk you through some of the main areas, and I'll walk you through how to set up that context, and then we'll look at impacts, risks, and opportunities, and then we'll continue to look at how we develop the standard and implement it in an organization. Now, firstly, while I appreciate there might be some people having troubles with audio and video, we're doing everything we can correctly on our side. We'll persevere and hopefully it will be improved. If we have issues with it, what we can do is we can also make available to you the recording of what we did this morning on the Asia session, which was an identical system. So if this ends up being too challenging, we'll release the other one for everybody so that you do have a copy. So apologies if that's happening. We'll persevere, but it may be that we will need to make some sort of initiatives. I will turn off my camera to try and reduce some of that network noise if that's in fact what's happening. So the context of the organization is pretty important. We need to set boundaries and we need to decide what is important in biodiversity. So hopefully, when you think about biodiversity in your organization, you're going to define what that means. Now, for some companies, you'll have a very significant biodiversity impact. In others, you'll have very little. So part of what we're doing at the start of the standard is we're just trying to define what are we focused on, what's the context, and what is the organization that we're going to be considering, and how does it impact with biodiversity. So again, the standard can apply to any organization. So you have to kind of set up the background so that you can define it in the way that works for you. Now, I mentioned before that the standard with ISO and with all of the ISO standards, in particular this one, is very focused on understanding your stakeholders. So like every other sustainability program where we consider our stakeholders and we engage with our stakeholders, this biodiversity standard is exactly the same. It considers our stakeholders. And as we all know, it's more than just listing stakeholders and mapping them out. We have to engage with them, which means we have to go through a process of identifying who they are, what they mean to us, what they mean to the environment, what impact we have on stakeholders, set up a relationship with them, engage with them, talk to them, keep them updated, communicate them, and build that cycle of engagement. The standard expects you to do that just like we would do for any other program in sustainability. Now, when we did the session this morning, some people asked questions around, well, give me an example of a stakeholder. Now, obviously, stakeholders or interested parties, as ISO calls them, are typically the sorts of parties that are impacted by the initiatives that we're driving. So they're affected parties. Now, when we start to look at interested parties, we need to think through both internal ones and external ones. So let's say I'm in a factory, and I'm in a village or a country town, and I'm surrounded by both communities and I'm surrounded by nature and biodiversity. Stakeholders could be my local community. It could be a local industry group. It might be the local scouts that use the location next door to us for scouting. It could be a bird watching association that watches birds in their local village that are impacted by our factory. It could be our customers, our suppliers, our employees. It's all the people that are related. So very standard definitions of what stakeholders are. So again, when we're building our stakeholder plan for biodiversity, we're thinking a little bit broader than the classic ones that we might have in sustainability, customers, suppliers, etc. Because we're thinking about our impact on nature around our business, and we're also thinking on who else is going to be impacted as a result of our connection with nature. So again, think more broadly than what we would typically do in the sustainability area. Now, obviously, these stakeholders are pretty important, and it's very important to the standard to understand them and to start engaging with them. So mapping them out, engaging with them, building a classic stakeholder engagement system is what's required as part of this standard. Now, this standard follows most other sustainability standard concepts. We've identified the context of the organization. We know what we're doing. We know who our stakeholders are. Now we're starting to think, well, what are the impacts, risks, and opportunities that we have in biodiversity? So how do we impact biodiversity and how could it impact us? So a classic IRO analysis when it comes to biodiversity, with a little bit of a twist. Biodiversity is a little bit different because there's a couple of extra pieces that are included. And that extra piece is really defined on the screen, and it relates to dependencies. So let's explain quickly what dependencies are. Now, as you go through identifying the classic impacts, risks, and opportunities, most of us are very familiar with how to do that. Dependencies are a little different. Because with biodiversity, we are in fact dependent on nature in many situations. So we have a dependency on nature. Let me give you an example. Let's say we're in a factory and we're located next to a river source. And we use the water in that river source for the purposes of cooling our equipment. So we are dependent on nature. We are dependent on that river to provide water for the purpose of our business. So when we start to think about biodiversity, we've got to start thinking about our dependencies, because it's our dependencies which are going to impact the business significantly. So in my example, we rely on water in the river. So if there's an ecological change that changes the availability of that water, it's going to clearly impact our business. So there's a dependency. We are dependent on that water. We may be dependent on that water to be flowing. We may depend it to be a certain temperature. We may depend on it to be a certain volume. So we have a dependency that could be at risk if any of those issues change. So dependencies are a really important part of biodiversity analysis. And it's a fundamental issue because our business is directly impacted if one of those dependencies fails. Now, we can all identify those dependencies relatively simply. The example I gave is a really simple one. The river, we need access to water. Now, we connect that to our business because if we can't cool our manufacturing plants, then we need to find alternatives which may be more expensive or more challenging or simply not be available. So we start to think about these dependencies, we start listing them, we start categorizing them, and we put them into different categories. Now, the standard walks through some categories for you and says, we'll put them into different categories. So for example, the water example is provisioning for us. It's provisioning water for us. But there may be other dependencies. For example, we're in the agricultural sector and we rely on bees for pollination. That's more of something like a regulating service. So there's different classifications of dependencies, but broadly speaking, they're straightforward. Now, once we understand that dependency, we then need to think through what's the ecological issue that is driving that dependency. So let me explain. We've got the factory, we've got the river, we need the water. But because of CO2 increasing in the atmosphere and because of the warming of the planet, we're finding that there is less snow in the mountains. As a result, when it comes to summer, we're finding there is less snow, less water coming into the river system, and not only is there less volume, but that water may be warmer. That is the problem that we're trying to identify when we look at dependencies. So we're looking not just at the dependency, access to the water, but we're looking at the ecological system that is going to affect that dependency. So we need to understand that dependency and the ecological system. Now, as we go through and we look at all of the dependencies across the business, we'll find that some of them are going to be more important than others. So as usual, you will build a materiality system. So you will identify those that are material versus not. We're all used to doing materiality, and we're all used to doing this analysis. Qualitative, quantitative, the same process applies. Now, as we go through the analysis to determine those dependencies, you'll talk to your stakeholders, you'll do workshops, you will look at the business, you'll conduct interviews. The practical side of doing dependencies is relatively straightforward. All of this understanding of dependencies, understanding the ecological cause of those dependencies, understanding its impact on the business, will then enable you to go to the next step, which is really thinking about how do we build resiliency into the business given these dependencies. So now that we've got the dependencies worked out, we can now say, well, what is the impacts, risk, and opportunities that we have in the business? Now, obviously, we all know what impacts mean, and we all understand the concept of IROs. So very similar concept to what we've experienced in other areas like carbon, biodiversity, and nature is very similar concept. So we won't spend a lot of time on it. The standard talks a little bit about what the difference between what an impact is and what a pressure is. And it's important to explain this concept. A pressure is, for example, if we are pushing something out into the river, so we're discharging wastewater into the river system, the discharging of the waste is the pressure, meaning we're putting a pressure on nature by discharging our wastewater. The impact on nature might be that wastewater causes an ecological challenge. It might cause some form of pollution, or it might cause heated water to be put into the water system, or it might cause some sort of impact. So the pressure is how we apply the issue. The impact is the result of that application. And it's important to think through that, because as we go through biodiversity and nature impacts, we've got to think, what's the pressure point that's driving that impact? Because remember, we, meaning the company, we are driving that impact. It's as a result of our operations that are leading to that impact. So we need to understand, well, what is it in our operations, i.e. the pressure that's causing that impact? So the standard gets you to think through all of those elements. Once we've got the impacts, we classify them. Very similar to what we do in other parts of sustainability. Now, there's some impacts that may be on land use or the sea or waterways. There may be impact around climate change. There may be impact in pollution. So it may be an air or sea or water or noise pollution or light pollution as a result of our impact. So there may be different impacts that we have. So these are classified. Then you map those to starting to do activities. So we're now going to say, we've got these impacts. What are the steps that we're going to take as a company in order to address some of those particular impacts? And this is where we start to build our initiatives, and we start to build the areas that we are going to focus on to try and reduce that impact, reduce that pressure, or manage those dependencies. Now, we know that there's probably going to be far too many impacts and far too many risks that we've identified. And so the same concept will apply here that applies in other parts of sustainability. We have to do those that are material. We focus on the material ones. The application of materiality in this standard is this common sense one that applies everywhere. We look at issues like frequency, likelihood, the cost. We look at the severity, the scale, the financial impact. We look at all those things. So we have to work on a material basis. The standard tells you, look at the impacts, risks, and opportunities, look at the dependencies, apply a materiality base. Now, as you're developing your risks and opportunities, you're going to be starting to identify, now that we've identified all these issues, what is the risk to the business? What is the risk on biodiversity? And we're starting to categorize those risks. Some of them will be risks that will be physical risks, so pushing the water out into the river causes pollution. Some of them will be systemic risks, meaning it's not so much that physical risk, but as a result of our activities, we are impacting the ecology of what's around us. So it may not be physical, but it's a system risk. There could be transition risks, meaning for years we've pushed out this water into the river, which has been perfectly legal, and now it's not going to be legal, or it's going to be restricted in some way. So there's a transitional issue that may lead us to have to make a change. And of course, there's always going to be opportunities where we might scrap that concept entirely and find another way to discharge effluent. So as you start to think through those opportunities, you're then going to get into this phase of saying, we've identified our risks, we've got our opportunities, we are now starting to understand what's material about all of those areas, and now we're going to prioritize them. We're going to keep talking to our stakeholders, we're going to keep assessing our company and making sure that we've right-sized our activities. Now we're going to build our action plan. So working out what is it that we are going to do, given all the information that we've now obtained. Setting smart goals, setting clear objectives, working out some of the actions that we are going to do to address those impacts, risks, and opportunities, decrease those dependencies, and actually identify new ways of managing our impact to biodiverse climates. Same issues that you will have experienced in other sustainability programs. Straightforward objectives, actions, in order to map those objectives, in order to map against those risks and opportunities and those dependencies. So again, a linked process where you start to focus on things that you've identified previously. Now, for each of those actions, you're going to start to set out, well, what is the action that we're doing? What is the goals? What are the KPIs? What are the objectives? We're going to start looking at what do we need to implement, what budgets, what resources, what technology, what tools. We're going to work out ownership, roles, and responsibilities on what the actions are. So we're going to build our criteria for working out the actions that we're going to take. Throughout this period, we're going to be communicating. So the standard spends a lot of time saying, look, don't operate in a vacuum. Build a system by which you integrate this biodiversity program, both inside the company and outside the company. So a continual communication system where you're fostering ideas, you're communicating with stakeholders, you're building in that engagement loop. All of those elements are key as part of what the standard wants you to do. So as you build that communications plan and you execute on that communications plan, this biodiversity set of initiatives will be quite strong and will become quite obvious to both internal and external stakeholders. Now, if you follow the path of where we're at now, we've identified the context of the organization, we've reached out to our stakeholders, we've identified our dependencies, we've got our impacts, our risks and opportunities, we've built our action plan, we've communicated our action plan internally and externally, we're implementing that action plan, and we need to now stand back and monitor and review the activities that we're doing to make sure that we are, in fact, achieving our objectives and our goals. So the standard forces you, once you're implementing, to start monitoring. So what are we doing that is leading to tangible results? What are we doing that's requiring us to think differently about those dependencies? What are we doing to decrease the risk of the lack of dependencies or the risks that we have on a biodiversity? So as you go through, you're starting to think about that monitoring system, and you're trying to work out what are the areas that you're going to focus on to monitor, and how would we do that? So you build that monitoring plan. Again, dashboards, KPIs, the output of that monitoring plan is key. So next steps and a couple of key things that I'd like to cover. Now, there's been a lot of comments from people, most questions around, can you download the slides? Can you get access to the recording, or a better recording, perhaps? The answer is yes, all of the above, will work it out. But a couple of questions that I want to address. Firstly, a couple of questions around, people have said, well, is this standard the same as TNFD, for example? The answer is totally different. TNFD is a disclosure standard. What that says is you need to tell the world, you need to publish some stuff about nature, biodiversity. So you need to publish these things. It's a publishing standard. It's a disclosure standard. This is different. This comes first. This standard builds your biodiversity system. The output of that system will be something that goes into your TNFD report. The outcome of this system will be something that goes into your CSRD report. The outcome of this system may go into your sustainability statements. But this is not a disclosure issue. This is like building a system around biodiversity issue. So they integrate together because the output of your biodiversity standard will feed into your reporting initiatives. So they're clearly linked, but they serve a different purpose. They serve a different purpose. Second question is, what does it look like from a perspective of implementation? Look, companies who are building biodiversity initiatives, depends on the size of the company, whether this is a relatively straightforward process because you've got a small number of IROs, or you've got a very complex process. So it's a very difficult question to answer. What I would say is that, like the climate change programs, like the greenhouse gas programs, like the programs that you're implementing around other key areas, the program that you'll implement around biodiversity and nature will also continue to exist. It will continue to exist for years. You'll continue to have this program and develop it and improve it and focus on it and keep managing those risks, developing the opportunities. You'll keep doing that. So this is not something which is going to go away. It's something that you're going to implement and manage going forward. And you'll continue to adjust and refine it as it goes forward. Getting it up to that stage where you could, for example, get it certified, my guess is that that's going to take 6 to 12 months, but that, again, could depend on the size of the company. The costs of getting these things, the standard itself, I don't know, it's $100. You can buy it from iso.org, where I buy mine. So, $100 to buy the standard. It's 50 pages long. It walks through all the things that I've told you. So buying the standard is straightforward. The training and education on the standard, something that Speeki does, straightforward. Implementing it and working through your organization, that's where the time is. They're the hard bits. But then the next piece is then if you want to get it certified, for example, much different dialogue, which we're happy to have. But you've got to have something first in order to certify it. Next things that I would consider. If you haven't already got a biodiversity initiative, I would pull down this standard and have a read of it. It is a very useful document. For those of you that have worked with Speeki before or been with us, we very much believe in standards. We very much believe in not reinventing the wheel. And we very much agree that we should leverage the work of many, not one. And so standards are really useful. So we're a big fan of standards. We also think that they're very useful to give a framework. And so very useful. Why not? Pull it down. It's great. It also is consistent with all these other ISO standards. So if you're very familiar with ISO standards, then you're going to see all the same words. So very useful dialogue. But they're the things that I would do first. And then I would start looking at a strategy of understanding the stakeholders and doing exactly as I've described in this process, in this webinar. So again, remember, this is a standard to build a biodiversity system. The output, some of the information in the system, some of the data from the system, some of the results of the system, some of the KPIs from the system, you may be able to pull out and put into your reporting. Send it off to the CSRD team, send it off to the team that's looking at TNFD perhaps. Well, this is going to be a system which produces data or information that goes into your disclosures. So you've got to have this system. If you need to want to disclose something, you've got to have this system first. So there is a lot of organizations out there that can help build these programs together. There are lots of consulting groups. There are lots of companies that help build these things. There are lots of initiatives out there that people are leading right now where they're implementing these programs under this standard. So there's a lot of knowledge out there. If you need further information, you're welcome to reach out to us. I know there were some challenges. Apologies. I don't know why. It's 12:30 a.m. my time, so maybe the internet is rebooting in my part of the world. But apologies. We will, of course, follow up and make sure that you've got copies of everything. If there are questions that you'd like us to address, you can address it on the next poll. So the team is going to launch a poll on the screen. If you do have a question you want it to respond to, just click on the poll and tell us what you would like to address, and we'll reach back out to you. Or you can always ping me or one of the team and we'll answer questions. If you want to set up a call, walk through this a little bit more detail, you're welcome to do so. But of course, as usual, we are open to all questions. So thank you for listening to this edition and persevering with what is a very frustrating internet access. So apologies on that, but I hope it was useful. I look forward to seeing you at other editions of the webinar series. And until then, and if I don't speak to any of you before then, have a happy holiday season and we'll talk to you again. Thanks again for listening. Take care.